The Sorrow and the Pity is a movie all about collaboration. The collaboration between the French government and the German government during World War II. This is the first documentary we've talked about on the channel, unless you count Notes Towards an African Orestes, which is hardly a movie at all. Since I really like subtle and naturalistic films, you might think that I'd love documentaries, but actually I have not seen very many. A lot of newer documentaries don't appeal to me very much. They aren't particularly subtle, they're sensational, or maybe today they're leaning into some kind of reality television idea. If you disagree with this ludicrous generalization, leave me some suggestions below. There are a couple of documentaries that I love, like Banksy's Exit Through the Gift Shop, which is a beguiling film, or the legendary Vietnam War documentary Hearts and Minds, which is the epitome of the even-handed documentary of like the 60s and 70s. In truth, I just haven't had time maybe to explore the documentary side of the world, and I have a couple thousand narrative films, normal movies, on my watch list. It's a tough list to break into, but I'm glad that I found the time to watch The Sorrow and the Pity because it's an astounding film. Speaking of time, this movie is 4 hours and 25 minutes long, almost as long as this video. It's not thrilling, but it is joltingly interesting at almost every turn. If you're wondering, I had already selected this film before last week. Some commenters suggested that I had a short attention span and was too young to appreciate old movies. Speaking of old movies, this one is from 1969. Is that old? Up to you. And that's about 25 years after the events that it focused on. When it first came out, it was banned in France. Actually, it wasn't, but a lot of people weren't too keen on seeing it. There was some friction. You'll see why. The movie was directed by Max Ophuls, who you might know from narrative films. He directed The Earrings of Madame de ... and Letter from an Unknown Woman. He had something for mysterious ladies, I guess. Whose earrings are these? Who sent me this letter? I've seen both of those movies. I don't remember a lot from them, though, to be honest. He also directed La Ronde, which is a legendary depiction of Vienna. I was in Vienna last week, and next week we'll do a movie that is set there. You can probably guess which one. If you need a hint, look behind me. Max Ophuls, from Germany, he was Jewish. The Sorrow and the Pity is a massive movie, and it's hard to know where to begin. The basic idea is that this is the story of France during World War II, or it's a story of France during World War II. I wouldn't call it a war movie, though. Obviously, it's in the neighborhood. I'm not a World War II history buff. If you are, I apologize for mispronouncing a few things and maybe letting a couple inaccuracies creep in. Sometimes people talk about wars almost like they're sports events. They know all the battles, they know all the guns, but it's not humanist, maybe. This movie is the opposite, which is what really interests me. There are some historical facts in this movie, but most of it is hearsay and conjecture. Well, it's people's experiences. We meet a couple of soldiers, a couple of members of the resistance, but this movie is mainly about things happening away from the battlefield. The Sorrow and the Pity sort of has an agenda, and it is a damning film, but it's also an extremely nuanced film with more angles in it than you can really cram into your head in one sitting. Tons of layers, tons of perspective. This is not a movie where all the interviews are tightly sewn together into one persuasive argument. Almost everybody in the movie has something a little bit different to say. Part of this movie is the story that all these people are telling. Another part of it is the telling of the story itself, the way that people are experiencing the past, the way they're remembering it, the way they think about the past when asked to share it with a guy who has a camera. There are a lot of layers here, but let's start simple. In the beginning of the movie, before you really know much about what happened, you get the feeling that people are talking a little bit sideways. They're not quite saying what they mean. You've probably heard stories of people being hesitant or in denial about the past or about World War II even. Germans, during World War II, apparently, nobody had any idea what was going on, right? This movie has some of that, but there's also a much more complex thing. That's kind of the simplest example, is denial, or justification, or feeling like you need to defend yourself. There's a lot of defensiveness in this film, certainly, but there's also more complex things going on. We start out with a few people who don't quite know where to put their feet, I would say. And why not? Well, the basic context is that France was the only European country to collaborate with the Nazi government after surrendering during World War II. At least that's what one of the people in the movie says. Of course, Germany occupied many countries during World War II. For instance, some of the most well-known Tintin cartoons were published while Hergé was working for a German-run newspaper in occupied Belgium. He had fled to France, but he chose to go back. These stories are fascinating to me. Most war movies are about soldiers, but what about the real people? It turns out that the vast majority of history is daily life. The older I get, And the more history I experience and live through, the more I'm fascinated by this link between history and what actually happened. The Sorrow and the Pity is one of the few movies that seems able to reverse that process, where real life is hardened into some kind of story. This movie goes the other way. Anyway, the basic idea is that after France surrendered, the Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, resigned, I guess for obvious reasons, and someone named Philippe Pétain was in charge. Pétain was a hero of World War I, a hero of the Verdun. He was widely respected, I guess, and he began to convince people that to rebuild the country, to eliminate poverty, to stave off communism, they should collaborate with Germany. In just about every other occupied country, the government fled, usually to England. For instance, there's a great early Paul Verhoeven movie about the Netherlands during World War II called Soldier of Orange. It's got Rutger Hauer in it. And in this movie, the king is hiding out in England, not only in the movie, but in real life too. But in this movie, you see the king hiding out in England. In France, this wasn't the case. De Gaulle was in England, at least part of the time, but the Vichy government was still in France, working towards National Socialism, shoring up business relationships with Germany, establishing youth societies reminiscent of the Hitler Youth, and eventually rounding up Jews, including children, and sending them to concentration camps in France and in Germany. After the war, Marshal Pétain was tried for treason and sentenced to life in prison, so they got him. But what about all the people that had supported him during the war? Most of these people were still walking around in 1969, just like most German soldiers, or the hotel manager whose lodging they requisitioned, or the minor bureaucrats and businessmen who kept the lights on, or the resistance fighters who hid from the light, or their neighbors who denounced them to the French government and the German one. Turns out they're all in this movie, thinking back on these unthinkable times. Let me talk a little bit about the style of this film before we get into it more deeply. This movie is mainly interviews. There are some interesting selections about where these are filmed. For instance, there's an interview with a German soldier seemingly at the wedding of his daughter or something like this. There's an interview with a French former fascist, sort of a fascist aristocrat, within the halls of a castle where Vichy heads of state like Marshal Pétain and Pierre Laval worked and lived. This is maybe the highlight of the movie. The end of that interview is a truly stunning quotation that is just, amazing. There is some subtext here. I'm not going to drag it out for you, but there's some interesting choices about where they have these things. Some of the interviews are conducted in groups. Sometimes it's a little bit more conversational. Sometimes Max Ophuls is in the shot. He contests a few things, inserts a few points of his own into the movie, but it's not particularly didactic. There is also a multimedia element to the film. There are a number of musical interludes with poignant undertones. There are a bunch of newsreels and propaganda films. Propaganda can be really interesting. Sometimes it's really predictable, but sometimes it's not at all what you would expect. For instance, there's a German newsreel in the movie where they say that 100,000 French workers have traveled to Germany to find jobs there, to join the economy. 100,000 French workers traveling to Germany. Is that true? I don't know, but man, that's interesting. You can see how this film just has so many layers. I should point out that one thing that is maybe slightly disappointing is that women are dramatically underrepresented in this movie. I'm pretty sure there were some back in the 40s, but you almost wouldn't know that from this film. Although there are stories about women who had relationships with Germans, women who worked for them, women who raised money to plant flowers near the trenches at the beginning of the war. But we rarely hear any of this from women. There are maybe 4 who speak at all in the entire movie out of tons and tons of interviews. One thing that I really like about The Sorrow and the Pity is that it completely demolishes a lot of the tropes we see in most World War II movies. Of course, most World War II movies are about soldiers, about battles, but sometimes we do see a couple of characters back home. There's 2 that come to mind. First, there's the lonely young farmer's wife, maybe a widow living alone in some cabin or farmhouse. Maybe she has a young child, and she's going to provide sanctuary, possibly more, to the other type of character, which is the brave secret agent or wounded soldier or resistance fighter, some kind of martyr. Maybe these things really existed, but all the stories we hear in this movie paint totally different pictures. For instance, we meet a British spy in this movie, but he's not exactly James Bond. He says he was too shy and bookish to be in the RAF or the Navy, but that he became a spy to prove to himself that he was brave, partly maybe to outrun some internalized shame of being a gay man. We hear about a relationship he had with a German officer, one he had to end because of his position. He says years later he inquired about the guy and he'd been killed on the battlefield. What a story. What a story. We hear a lot about the resistance, and it's a complicated thing. Lots of different people, lots of different types of people, lots of different political interests. There's an uneasy alliance between communists and patriots, for example. People come from all walks of life. Class is a huge, huge thing in this movie. You get some interviews with some rich people who are like, yeah, well, it was tough, but then once the Germans allowed us to go hunting again, well, things were really looking up, right? One interviewee says that the defining thing about resistance members is that they were outcasts, misfits, or even failures. And maybe he was just projecting, but maybe there's something to that, and it's not at all what you see in most movies. We hear stories about soldiers, the brave soldiers of film. Well, we hear stories about them hoping that the war would end, hoping that they would be defeated, practically setting their weapons down. Not what you see in the movie. I guess the biggest reversal is simply the idea that everyone thought that the Germans were the bad guys and would fight until the end against them. That might not even have been true within the army. It certainly was not true among citizens. In the early parts of the film, when people are discussing the armistice, we hear a lot about the tension between pacifism and resistance. A lot of people simply wanted the war to end, and who can blame them? There were plenty of reasonable arguments for collaboration, especially if you didn't know the full picture, maybe only if you didn't know the full picture. Collaboration itself obviously doesn't sound that bad. Once the armistice was signed, there was a storm of political introspection. How have we fallen? How did we lose? Some people blamed the party system in France for eroding national standards, sowing division, and dooming the country. I guess in Germany, they didn't have that problem. Many of the promises of National Socialism and the collaborationist government almost sounded progressive, at least when you watched them in propaganda newsreels. These claims like eliminating poverty, improving schools, the Vichy government was full of initiatives, even though their power was probably not very significant. In the movies, everybody hates the Germans and is pulling for the underground, but here we hear from tons of Pétain supporters. Max Ophuls asks some of them, why did you support Pétain? Some of them just say, well, I respected him. I thought he was a good guy, right? Other people have more in-depth ideas. This fascist aristocrat I mentioned earlier, he says that he knew that there'd be two ideas that would change the world, Marxism and fascism. And he said, well, because of my lot in life in the aristocracy, I knew I couldn't be a Marxist. We hear from freedom fighters who were denounced to the government by their neighbors, and we hear from their neighbors. It's a huge reversal from this idea that everybody was fighting tooth and nail against Germany. I really am so interested in things that people do not talk about. Things that are erased, secrets. The more people that know the secret, the better. I mean, that's incredible. And this seems like an enormous secret. Of course, I did wonder a little bit about revisionism when I was watching this movie, and I don't think maybe saying it's like this huge secret isn't quite right, because it's more complicated than that. I think there is some risk that this movie overrepresents all these stories, that it's sort of digging for the most controversial bits, that's trying to be what you don't expect, right? That's some of the things I think about with revisionism in some ways, sort of gluing today's morals onto yesterday and showing you that, in fact, history isn't at all what you thought it was like. I don't think that's quite what this movie is doing here. Revisionism, by the way, I know people there's a lot of different definitions for that term, so I'm using it pretty loosely. Anyway, this movie has so many angles in it, it's hard to say that it is... Yeah, I think it's hard to criticize it in that regard. Eventually, of course, the war ended. And this minor spoiler there. And the movie covers a little bit of what happens after the war. A swift counter-reaction, makeshift courts, executions, hasty justice, and the beginning of a national disappearing act, the beginning of amnesia and erasure. So interesting, man. So interesting. Let me touch on a couple of specific stories that come out of this movie. I paused the film so many times to look things up. This isn't the sort of documentary that explains a bunch of stuff and lays it out. There's no diagrams. Well, there might be a map or two. It's pretty easy to follow, and you can pause it and head over to Wikipedia. First up, on just the interesting pointers of sort of things they kind of talk about a little bit, is the Mers el Kabir incident, part of Operation Catapult. This was an attack on French ships stationed in Algeria by the British Navy. This was after the armistice, and the British were worried that the French ships, would be used by Germany. There is a logic to this, but it's surprising to hear about the British Navy killing members of the French Navy. And we get an interview with a guy pretty high up in the British government, Anthony Eden, something like that, who talks about some of the decision-making behind this and is confronted by the decision a little bit. Extremely interesting. Man, this is a time of so much uncertainty. One of my favorite things in film and in life. So much uncertainty at every single level. Later in the film, we see some interesting aerial footage from a bombing run where French planes bombed the outskirts of Paris. Okay, there's a section in this film based on movies, too. This is a great one. We see part of the trial of Bernard Nathan, who was a huge film producer. He owned Pathé, but it collapsed during the Great Depression. He was tried for fraud and convicted, probably not legitimately. He was in prison when Germany invaded and was eventually denaturalized, something that France did to a lot of its Jewish citizens, or former citizens. He was denaturalized, he was sent to Auschwitz, and he was killed. In this section on film, we also hear about a movie called Jude Seuss, Seuss the Jew. This was a German propaganda film from 1940, I think. As some of the interviewers were talking about this movie, I paused it to look it up on IMDb, thinking that maybe I could feature it on the channel, although I think videos on these topics might get buried by the algorithm. I guess we'll see what happens to this one. Anyway, I read up on this movie for a little bit, and then when I went back to The Sorrow and the Pity and restarted it, they cut in some shots showing clips from Seuss the Jew, and I thought, oh, great, it's like they read my mind. The cinematography in that movie looks incredible, seems interesting, although it is, of course, a sickening piece of propaganda. The main character in this movie is Seuss Oppenheimer. Max Ophuls' real name, Max Oppenheimer. I guess this movie isn't as well known as some of Ophuls' narrative works. Like I said, I can barely remember his two movies that I have seen. This one is going to stay with me forever. It's hard to overstate the value of The Sorrow and the Pity, and I'm not just talking about the value to me personally. I'm not just saying it's fun to watch. It isn't particularly fun. I'm not just saying that it's interesting. It is extremely interesting, one of the most interesting movies I've ever watched. The value is something else. This is a movie that is important to society in some way, although ideally, maybe a few more people would watch it. I think it's possible that one reason I haven't seen many documentaries is some deep down fear that they will spoil narrative films in some ways, that after seeing reality, you won't be able to go back. Well, I definitely will be going back next week, for instance, but if there's any topic where things might start to feel a little hollow, and any movie that could turn all the other ones into dust a little bit, it would be this one, and possibly Shoah, which now from a great distance seems to be calling my name.